Turn there. We're going to pick up where we left off last week. We are doing a series on the nature and the cost and consequence of sin. We are a church that still believes that there is this thing called sin, that it is something that is toxic, it is something destructive. We are commanded to avoid it, reject it, resist it in the Lord and by the power of His Spirit, because yielding to sin and giving into your sinful nature brings about cost, consequence, and beyond. 2 Samuel 11 and 12 both outline the story of King David. It was the golden age of Israel. It was the apex of his ministry. Nothing could go any better. And it was in that season that we see David commit a series of sin, one building upon another in this tragic sequence of events that I want to briefly overview, and then we're going to pick up with new material. And we talked last week about, sin has cost, sin does not satisfy, sin begets more and worsening sin, and that sin enslaves. Once again, I'm going to go through quickly, bird's eye view of the story. I'm not going to read it in its totality, but I want to give you enough of a working knowledge so even if you never read the story before, you'll know some of the major elements that took place. We see in 2 Samuel 11 verse 1 in the early text that David, despite his success as king, has become negligent in his kingly duties. You want to know what ruins many believers? It's not difficulty, it's ease. When things are going well, we can get lax. How many have ever been there before? Am I just talking to myself? David, everything is going well. And that's when he begins to neglect his duties and rather lead the armies as he ought to have done. He delegated it off to a subordinate named Joab. And in the midst of that time when all the men were away fighting war, David is looking out of his palace and he sees a woman bathing on the roof. She was beautiful, no sin in a sense of saying, wow, that's a pretty girl. But he got her phone number, proverbially speaking, brought her in. Oh, it turns out she's married. What should David have done in the moment that he found out that this woman named Bathsheba was married? It was really nice to meet you. You got to go home. That's not what happens. I'm going to keep this G-rated. He sleeps with her. She becomes pregnant. And now David really has a problem because guess where the husband was? Off fighting a war. So when that husband comes home and it turns out that she's pregnant, unless it's immaculate conception, this thing is going to be a royal scandal of epic proportions. So David calls the man named Uriah home from the field of battle, and he does everything that he can to just get this guy to go home. I'm not going to spell this out too much, but if the husband goes home after a long time of being away, and it turns out that the woman is pregnant, he's going to assume that it was his, conceived during that time when he was home. This guy will not go home. He does everything but go home. David gets him drunk. He still won't go home. So rather than fess up and recognize that what he had done, speaking of David, was treacherous and wrong, he manipulates the situation, and very long story short, he has this guy killed. His own servant, his own soldier, that he should have been leading, and this servant who was just super loyal and faithful to the Lord and his king, he has him killed. And I think the most tragic aspect of that reality is when David gets news of the success of his plan in getting this person killed, he shows no remorse. He simply says in a callous and apathetic way, the sword devours one as well as the other. Too bad, so sad, as they would say. It's at this point that the Lord, who will not stay silent forever, begins to engage. And he sends a prophetic voice, a prophet named Nathan, to go and to confront the king and expose the horror of what had taken place. And we see really this threefold promise, if you will. Number one is the son that was born of the affair would die. Number two, the sword would never depart from the house of David. David, who had known peace and success and victory and elevation and revelry in the Lord, who had had a family, he had many sons, God promised those very sons would rise up in treachery. And if you keep reading the subsequent chapters, I hate to say it, but that's exactly what happened. In all of the sinfulness that took place in David, his sons went on to perfect, in a sense, in greater measure, sexual immorality and treachery and beyond. And God promises that David would experience very public humiliation for private crimes. So that was last week. And we talked about, again, that sin comes with consequence. Persist in sin long enough, and God's going to eventually take that thing to task. If you deal with sin, and by the way, all eyes this way, we all do at times. How many have it perfect all the time? Just perfectly loving, perfectly joyful, perfectly peaceful. I'm watching for thunderbolts over there. I saw a hand go up. Never lose your temper, always parent well. Somebody cuts you off on the highway and you just say, praise the Lord, this is an opportunity for me to practice my patience and show mercy and grace. I drove in Worcester yesterday, as did my wife. It's a madhouse down there. Try Boston. Worcester was rated as being worse, by the way. Just fun fact, Worcester is now on paper as having the worst drivers in the state, which I believe. And I'm from Worcester, so I can make fun of it all that I want. We mess up. We're wayward. We do dumb things. But when you do, don't try to cover it up. Confess it. Let God forgive you, pardon you, and not just forgive you with the I'm so sorry and then you do it again, but God, not only forgive me, but transform me so that I don't have to keep yielding to this thing. God has not called you to forever languish in the same sin over and over and over again. He is not only gracious enough to forgive you, but he's gracious enough to elevate you out of that thing so that you can be his in greater measure. So I want to spend some time this morning looking at further reasons why not to sin, the nature, the overflow of sin, if you will. So again, note takers, we covered 4 last week. I'm going to repeat them one more time for the last time. Sin comes with a cost. Number 2, sin, it does not satisfy. It might bring you a smile very, very, very temporarily, but that sense of happiness, it will be fleeting. Number 3, sin begets sin. You give into sin, you want to sin again, and it just goes to ever-increasing degrees of frequency and degree. And again, number 4, sin enslaves. Review last week's message. The notes are online. The sermon is online. I want to begin with the following point out of 5 this morning. I'm going to move quickly. I'm going to feed you with a fire hose. My advice, if you're a note taker, write down what sticks, because maybe one point will really impact you of the 5. Number 1, sin degrades and humiliates. You should all be writing that down. Sin degrades and humiliates. Why should I resist sin? Why should I say no to temptation when it comes knocking, and it inevitably does? Because by nature, it degrades and humiliates. We're going to play a game. You ready? It's not going to be a very fun game, but a game nonetheless. I'm going to say a name, and I want you to consider the first thing that pops into your brain. You ready? I might even ask for some crowd help and raise a hand, and you can tell me the first thing. Please be careful with this, by the way. I actually changed some names because they may not lead to good ends. Judas Iscariot. What's the first thing that pops into your brain? Betrayal. It wasn't the fact that he was known to cast out demons and cleanse lepers and even raise the dead potentially, because Jesus gave all 12 the authority to do that. It was none of that. It was treachery. It was betrayal. Let's modernize it. And by modernize, I mean let's go to the 60s and 70s. Half of you weren't even born yet. President Richard Nixon. First thing, come on, what is it? Raise a hand. Watergate. Watergate signifying, again, his own treachery, his own failings as a leader. It wasn't the fact that he had paved the way for Chinese relations and a whole host of other accomplishments. The first thing you think about, Pavlovian reaction, if you will, Watergate. We're going to go old school again, back to the 80s. Jim Baker, first thing. He was a preacher, for those who may not know. Wildly successful preacher in the early 80s. First thing that pops into your brain, go. Yeah. Adultery, I think there was more, but yeah. His ministry kind of blew up overnight. Here's a sad one. Some of these make me so sad because they had great beginnings. You ready? Bill Cosby. It's not the Cosby Show anymore. It's not humor. It's not a great comedy sketch. I'm not going to say what Bill Cosby did. We could go on and on. I have more on my list. Jeffrey Epstein, Harvey Weinstein, President Bill Clinton, Joe Paterno. You go down the list. These were wildly successful people in their season. But what's the first thing that we think of when we hear these names now? Scandal, moral failing, depravity, some kind of sinfulness. Because sin by nature, it degrades and it humiliates. Now, I'm not saying that once you commit sin, there's no road back. There is forgiveness. But can I give you a very unfortunate truth? Even when the Lord is willing to forgive, and he does, other people, your peers, not so much. And you have to live with the stigma associated with your behavior. And you can tell people God has forgiven me, and that's true. But frankly, most people don't care. You got to live with it. This is a quote from a book, Go and Sin No More, by my Bible school president for a time, Michael Brown. He says, think about that public figure, the president, a sports star, a prominent educator, that's worked for years to gain the respect of people and establish a reputation. And then look at what happens to that reputation when that person commits some gross sin and that sin finds them out. Everything changes. A reputation is sullied, and now you look at that person differently. That person has become polluted, colored, stained. All that hard-earned popularity and all of their accomplishments become compromised in a moment. You know what's sad? Good news doesn't spread all that fast. You do something great, maybe you'll get 3 people to clap for you. But everybody loves a tragic story. And that kind of message travels quickly. Next time you're tempted to sin, I want you to consider these examples, but consider King David for a moment. And I want to ask you a few questions, and I want you to process through these rather quickly as we move on. How do you think his children saw him from this moment on? Once the sin was exposed and this thing, it went public. How do you think his other wives felt? I don't know why any human would engage in having multiple wives. I'm looking at my wife who's to my left, you're right. It's tough to keep one person happy, never mind a few dozen. And then you think of his son Solomon, 700 wives and 300 legal stand-ins. Brother, you're just nuts. How they see David from that moment on. I bet they had a look in their eye. I can't really do the look that Misty gives me now and then. How do you think Bathsheba saw him? How about his soldiers? Imagine you're a loyal soldier serving under David, and you heard what he had done to Uriah. Do you think that's going to affect morale at all? What about the nation? What about the surrounding pagan nations? I bet a lot of ungodly people had a laugh at the ungodliness of David, saying, see, they're no different than us. They talk a good game, those Christians, those believers, but in the end, they're just as messed up as we are. Next time you're tempted to sin, consider what that thing will do to your reputation and to your standing. It degrades and it humiliates. Moving quickly, number 2, sin steals joy. Joy. It steals it. Joy is a precious commodity that many seek to acquire fervently. I'm going to take my time. Give me a few extra minutes this morning. This message is important enough because if this can help you to keep from sin, this is a victory. Some people pursue joy in romantic and or sexual pleasure. Ours is a society just given to sexual indulgence, hoping that in that and through that they'll find happiness and joy. I wish them well. They will not. You will not. Lord Byron, I have a quote, romantic poet and satirist, lived a life of pleasure with women and Mediterranean boys. And he wrote the following in the end, the worm, the canker, and grief are mine alone. all that fun, all that good time. How did it end? Misery. Some people pursue wealth or financial means and hoping that if they have just enough money, it'll fill that void and it'll bring joy, but it doesn't. I have in my notes Jay Gould, who was an American railroad financier and speculator, worth untold amounts of money, stated the following while dying: "I am the most miserable man on earth. I've lived long enough to see enough rock stars and celebrities delete themselves. Don't tell me that money and fame and fortune's enough to make you happy. Because if it was, why have I already lost so many icons in my life? And if you're older, you could probably name way more. Some people pursue joy, again, in position, prestige, and notoriety." Lord Beaconsfield, never heard of him. He was a British author and politician. He enjoyed his fair share of popularity and acclaim, but in the end he stated, "Youth is a mistake, manhood a struggle, old age a regret." That guy sounds like someone you want to invite to your party. Final one. Some people pursue joy through conquest and power. It's a seductive thing. Shared the story before that Alexander the Great conquered the known world of his day, and having done so, it's recorded that he wept in his tent saying, and I quote, "There are no more worlds to conquer." Now, segue to David. David was a man who knew the joy of the Lord, which, by the way, the joy of the Lord is your what? If you have no joy, guess what you have none of? Why do you think you're always so overrun and over? Where's your joy? What's your joy in? Is it the Lord? David had joy. He knew joy. Psalm 16, don't turn there. Verse 11, "You make known to me," David speaking to the Lord, "the paths of life. You fill me with joy," where? In your presence. Psalm 28, verse 7, "The Lord is my strength and my shield. My heart trusts in him. He helps me. My heart leaps for," you want to guess what the word is? Joy. But do we see any indication of joy in the account of David versus Bathsheba? Do we see him shouting with joy at all? The answer is no. Do we see David singing any songs in the midst of all of this? Do we see him dancing wildly unto the Lord in this scene? No. Do we see him penning any psalms or worshiping the Lord at all? And the answer is no. Isn't it funny that this man who was so known for his joy in the Lord seems to have lost it entirely in these chapters? To once again quote that book, Go and Sin No More. When sin enters the picture, our joy is sapped. The strength we once possessed seems to dissipate, and our passion depletes. Our enthusiasm to connect with the Lord in prayer, praise, and worship is curbed, and our victory seems to depart for far-off shores. Gone is the bounce in our step and the song in our heart. Why? Because sin steals joy. It promises much, but leaves us guilty, ashamed, and hollow. In your own time, read Psalm 51. Which is a psalm that David composed after the exposure of his sin. And you want to know what you're going to find in that chapter? You're going to find much of, "Lord, restore to me the joy of your salvation." The recognition that he had done much to forfeit the source of joy, but he wants to reconnect because sin didn't satisfy, and ultimately it robbed him of the joy that he knew. Moving along quickly, number 3, what else does sin steal? Your time. Time is a precious commodity. Our lives are finite. We measure our time by days, weeks, months, years. Not many people live to even see a century, and a century is the smallest fraction of time on a cosmic scale in some ways. The Bible, penned by David, Psalm 39, speaking to the Lord, "You have made my days a mere handbreadth." That's about that, by the way. "The span of my years, it's as nothing before you. Everyone is but a breath, even those who seem the most secure." I'm a relatively young minister, 44 years old. I know I look 29, but I'm 44. I can't tell you how many people I've already buried, friends I've said goodbye to, performed the ceremonies for, peers, adults. My first funeral, 19-year-old kid. I begged not to perform the ceremony because it was my first one, and I wasn't ready. And the pastor, in his wisdom, said, "Son," and I'm paraphrasing, "suck it up." This is what you want to be and do. Get to work. I want you to consider how sin steals time. We lose time in committing the sin. We lose time in running from God in conviction. We lose time in confessing the sin. We lose time in trying to resist the next time sin comes knocking on our door. Let's consider King David. You ready? We're going to go fast. Download the notes on Tuesday or Wednesday. How long was he absent from the front lines leading his men in his negligence? How long did he lust after the bathing beauty Bathsheba? I love the alliteration of that. How long did it take for David to secure her information? How long did the one night stand with her last? How long did it take to discover that she was pregnant? How long did it take to recall Uriah from the battle lines? How long did it take to pen the letter to the general of Israel to have him killed? How long did David wait for word from said general regarding the success or the failure of the mission? How long did it take for God to speak both David and the prophet Nathan? How long did it take for David to communicate the words, I have sinned? How long did it take for David to deal with the promised outflow in the fallout of his failings with Bathsheba? How long did it take for David to feel a sense of inner restoration, moving beyond the guilt and the sting of sin? Can I give you the answer to all of those questions? Way too long. And sadly, every moment of it was needless. It never needed to happen at all. You know, the reality is, gang, life is pretty tough. Who's been alive longer than 7 minutes and you've just realized already, this thing is tough? I'm going to give you some wisdom, and I'm speaking it to myself as well. Life is tough enough. Don't make it harder by misbehavior and misdeeds. Because it's one thing to struggle through no fault of your own and to have to navigate a season that God has allowed to come into your life for your betterment and for your elevation in Him. But it's another to burn time navigating a situation that God never wanted for you and it's of your own making. That's rough. Because even time that's spent in a positive way, asking for God to forgive, asking for God to strengthen and beyond, all of it's frankly just catching up to the fact that you made a wrong turn and now you have to backtrack. Ever drive through Worcester or Boston and you're following GPS and maybe you're not paying attention and you miss a turn and then it has to recalculate the route to bring you back to where you missed it, and it's like new time estimated 20 more minutes. You know what that 20 minutes is? It's a waste of time. It's needlessly spent time. But if you want to keep going, it's time that you have to expend nonetheless. Sin is that way. It just steals from you. And one of the things it steals is time. Final one, I'll end with this. I want you to listen to the deep theology of this. Are you ready? Sin hurts. I'm going to go a little bit deeper. I'm not going to just end with those two words. But sin hurts in a threefold direction. Number one, if you will, is sin hurts the sinner. When you engage in sin, you're just bringing harm on yourself. Even if it's not physically harmful, again, there's still the associated cost of it. It's not going to satisfy you. It's going to get more and worse sin. It's going to steal your time. It's going to steal your joy and beyond. I think of David. To what degree, and I have this in my notes, was this true in the life of David? Did it hurt him? And the answer is yeah. I'm sure that it hurt when he lost his child. I'm sure it hurt him when he had to deal with a sullied reputation. I'm sure it hurt him when one of his sons rose up to rape his sister and another went on to lead a coup. I'm sure all of that hurt. It hurts the sinner's friends and family. That's number two. You know, no one in this world is an island in a sense. We are so interconnected. And your decisions have a way of reverberating in and through the lives of the people around you. You know, sometimes I joke, I'll just pick on Sean Barry because he's there and he raised his hand earlier claiming perfection. Sometimes, you know, Sean's a good friend of mine. I think I can say that, right? Good. He even called me family. You may come to regret that at some point, but I digress. And I'll say to him if we're talking, you know, silly, you know, Sean, you know, I say something foolish or Sean does, and I write the headline, Sean Barry, This is how the reports would go if he did something dumb. Member of New Life Assembly of God in South Barrie, 60 Main Street, did X, Y, and Z. This church has been through that before, as a matter of fact. You see, some of you are coming into a time when the church is relatively healthy. And again, I use the word relatively because there's always room to grow. But this church has been through some things when some of you weren't even here or weren't even born yet. And the misdeeds of an individual cost the body greatly. We have family, we have friends, we have spouses, we have kids. And your choices aren't just yours. When you move, even if they're completely innocent and not culpable of any wrongdoing, it can still affect them. I have in my notes, who was hurt by the sinfulness of David in this account? Let's start with Bathsheba. You know, in our generation, we talk about people who are in power. There's power imbalances in our structures at times, and there are some people that have a hard time saying no to a boss and beyond. Imagine being called in by the king. Do you think she really wanted to cheat on her husband? Be honest. Sin hurt her. And I imagine from this moment on, it brought her unceasing pain. Had to bury a kid over it. I'm sure she never played well with the other wives. You think of the infant who died. You can say it wasn't fair of God to take the life of the child. Gang, God could take all of us and it would be perfectly just, because the wages of sin is... He could lightning bolt you right now and be perfectly righteous in doing so. The fact you are allowed to breathe, it's grace. Keep that in mind. You think of the children of David, who would go on to manifest the same sinfulness, but in more heinous degrees. Where do you think they learned the behavior in the first place? You think of his soldiers. You think of the broader nation and the calamity of a coup, what effect that would have on civilization and society at that point. And I'm going to end with this. And this is in some ways the most significant of the points regarding sin hurts. And if you love the Lord, this is the one that should keep you from sin the most. You ready for this? Sin doesn't just hurt you, the sinner, and it doesn't just hurt your friends and family and beyond, but it hurts the Lord. You're in 2 Samuel 11. Go to chapter 12. And I'm going to read a paragraph to you. And I want you to feel, if you will, the emotion in the heart of God in what God is saying through the prophet to David. And this is one selection of many that I could put forth. There are entire chapters in the Old and in the New Testament that reflect what I'm about to say. Let's go to verse 7 as I prepare to close. Couple of words in. This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Now again, as we read this, I want you to consider the emotion behind it. I anointed you king over Israel, and I delivered you from the hand of Saul, who was the previous king. I gave your master's house to you, and your master's wives into your arms. I gave you all Israel and Judah, the northern and the southern kingdom. And if all this had been too little, I would have given you even more. Now, verse 9 is where it starts to pick up in terms of the emotion of the Lord. Why did you despise the word of the Lord by doing what's evil in his eyes? You struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword, and you took his wife to be your own. You killed him with the sword of the Ammonites, an enemy. In verse 9 now, therefore the sword will never depart from your house, because you despised what? Me. Isn't that an interesting fact, by the way? That David's sin was really against Uriah and Bathsheba, but God took it personally. Because in despising them, David, you actually despised me. And you took the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your own. Verse 11, this is what the Lord says, out of your own household I am going to bring calamity on you. Before your very eyes I will take your wives and give them to one who is close to you, and he will sleep with your wives in broad daylight. Speaking of his son. You did it in secret, but I will do this thing, and I close, in broad daylight with all Israel. Can you feel the Lord's heart in that? You know, when I read that, it's not robotic or surgical and God just speaking in a cerebral, intellectual way. There's emotion there. God's pained by what David had done, not just to his peers, but ultimately to him. He viewed it as a betrayal. I gave you everything. I would have given you more. Why? Make me understand. And frankly, there's no good answer in response, because there's no justification to what David had done. Next time you're tempted to sin, and it happens all the time, and if you're already committed or engaged in certain ungodly behaviors, it tends to happen more and more and more, because once the enemy has a hook, he's going to come knocking all the time. I'm going to call you to remember that sin comes with a cost. It's not going to satisfy you. It's going to beget more and worse sin. It seeks to enslave and dominate. It degrades, it humiliates, it steals your joy, it steals your time, and it hurts you, the people that you love, but most importantly, the Lord. So next time the enemy comes and says, hey, I have a good idea. Let's try something. Let's do this. You know what you say? No thanks. What does the Bible say, the opening of this series? Submit yourselves then to God, resist the devil, and he'll flee. You know what? Tell him to go pound sand. No. And if you already invited him in and he's already, as I proverbially say, at the breakfast table in the morning, you come down and you just see him in a sense because he's just so used to being in your orbit, some of you got to spiritually evict him and the forces that he brings along and say, I am not going this way anymore. And you resist, and you resist, and you resist. You say no. You ground yourself in the Lord, in his word. You become prayerful. If necessary, invite some other people that are trusted voices to help you navigate that time, keep you accountable. And the time will come when he's going to realize, you know what, that no longer works on Melissa, and it no longer works on Misty, and it no longer works on Sean. I'm going to pick on someone else because I only have so much time to expend anyway. Speaking of Satan and his forces, submit to God, resist the devil, and he will flee. In this sermon series, 3 parts, they'll all be online in a couple of days, is designed to equip you to simply say no. Let's close in a word of prayer, and then a few things as we dismiss. Heavenly Father, this is a hard message, but this is where Christianity really comes to life. It's in the daily application of these principles. Because you don't want us just to come together and sing pretty songs and go home and live broken. You desire for us to be conformed into the image of Jesus, to say no to the enemy in ever-increasing degrees and yes to you. God, I pray that the seeds that have been cast over the last 3 weeks, that they would find soil in the hearts of these individuals, including my own. God, next time we're tempted to sin and we feel the enemy luring us in a direction, give us the wherewithal and the wisdom to remember these principles because they are life-saving to those who put them into practice. God, as we go our separate ways or as we stick around for potluck supper, I pray your blessing, I pray your favor, I pray your peace upon these fine people. Draw them to you. And God, if there are any here who don't know you, maybe they're here or they're tuning, and I pray that this would be the day of salvation to give themselves to you. That we would all have the wisdom like David to say, you know what, I've sinned. That we might find forgiveness and pardon in Jesus' name. And everyone said,